Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. Well, Donald Trump has picked Pete Hegseth, a Fox News host and veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to be his Secretary of Defense, where he would lead the 1.3 million active duty men and women of the American military. He is an unconventional pick for the post. And here to discuss Hegseth is John Waters. He is a contributor to Real Clear Defense and the author of the novel River City 1. So, John, welcome to the program. Tell us what you think about Pete, and what do you make of him as a potential Secretary of Defense?
Andy, I think he's an honest choice from President Trump. I think it's unexpected to many people, perhaps in the Beltway, who work at think tanks, whose life is politics, though they don't run for office. But for someone who is a war veteran and is not from D.C., I think it's a strong and honest choice. And Pete Hegseth has said exactly what he wants to do. He wrote a book produced earlier this year, The War on Warriors. President Trump mentioned it in his announcement of Hegseth. And he said he wants to attack the institution. He wants to root out what he thinks is extremism ideologies. He wants to return the Defense Department to meritocracy, to fighting wars, to lethality, to standards of excellence that are fair across the board. I think it's an honest choice from the president.
Well, all that may be true. He's 44 years old, and as you say, he's been pretty clear what Trump wants to do, and because he's been a television host and written books, he's out there, he's got a public record, but he doesn't have any experience running anything, let alone something as large as the Pentagon. And that's one of the early knocks on him right now, is that he doesn't have the sort of business experience that you would expect for someone in this post.
He's not an administrator. He's not a lawyer or a lobbyist. He's not from that very small community inside of D.C. But I think the real question is, what is this man's judgment in a crisis? That's what it really gets down to. And in 2003, when he graduated from Princeton and went to work at Bear Stearns, the now defunct investment bank, he had the world open to him. But for some reason, he chose to become an infantry officer in the Army. Now, he didn't just decide to serve at a time of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He decided to serve as an infantry officer. He knew he would walk the ground. He knew he would lead young men from across the country, young men 18 and 19 years old who were going to volunteer from Oklahoma and Nebraska regardless. He chose to be their leader. A Princeton graduate, someone who'd worked as an analyst at Bear Stearns, was choosing to go to war and lead these young people. So he deploys to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He comes home, somehow leaves the guard and becomes active duty so that he can volunteer to deploy to Iraq, Baghdad, Samarra, 2004, 2005. He's leading people in combat in Iraq. He comes back home, goes back into the reserves, deploys again to Afghanistan in 2012, toward the tail end of President Obama's surge, which started in 2010 and 2011. So this man has deployed many times. He's led people at the infantry level, maybe at larger levels as well, in combat. What does that mean for his judgment in a crisis? I think it means a lot.
Let's talk about policy for a minute. He said recently on a podcast this month, he opposes having women in combat roles. That's going to put him at odds with certain elements within the Pentagon. He's very much on the record of being sort of anti-woke. So what do you think the building and the defense community will do when they faced with Secretary of Defense like this, who sort of wants to roll back a lot of the policies that they've embraced for the last 4, 8, 12 years?
He's presenting a transformational type of agenda, which is totally in line with the president, so it should not be a surprise. But you're absolutely right, Andy. Reinstate a ban on transgender troops, end abortion travel policies, reconsider the erasure of Robert E. Lee and others from our military installations, roll back diversity programs. And in a recent interview with Sean Ryan, he said it should start at the top with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, who's less than 2 years into his 4-year term as chairman. He has been critical of President Obama's 2015 decision to drop gender-based restrictions and allow women to serve in combat units, as much because it lowered the standards for those units as anything else. So I think all of these positions are controversial, probably, for many inside of the Pentagon, and will lead to conflict inevitably and confrontation.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the question comes, even if you were in favor of these policies, let's say you said, gee, this is what the president wants to do. This is what he's been voted in to do, that he's got a mandate to do this. Again, I come back to this idea that Pete Hegseth, for all the things you've said about him, being sort of effective as a leader, obviously successful, career as a writer, all that sort of stuff, no experience running anything that would have the sort of bureaucratic complexity of the Pentagon. And so I'm wondering if there's going to be pushback on that point alone. In other words, even if you agree with him, gee, is this the right guy for this job, or should he have taken a lesser job?
Which might be exactly the point. If the job is transformation, you may not want someone with a long history of experience in bureaucracy and administration. I'll think back at this time to something Elliot Cohen told me, distinguished professor at SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, former very senior defense official in the Bush administration. He said, being smart, which I think is sort of what you're saying, being smart is overrated. There's plenty of smart people in DC. You hire smart. What we need is people who have judgment in a crisis. For those of us, and I'll reveal my bias, avocado toast millennial war veterans who signed up after September 11th, which includes Pete Hegseth, there's a sense that something went wrong in the Department of Defense and in the military over a generation at war. And yet there's also a sense of how much is owed to the people who know the ground truth, to the enlisted men and women who fought those wars, who came home after those wars, feeling like strangers in their country, feeling like something changed that they didn't understand. I think what's interesting about Pete, additionally, you mentioned his TV experience, his popular book writing, is that folks out in the greater country have a relationship with this man. I talked to a lady in my neighborhood. She's 70 years old. She said, boy, I hope he does what he said he was going to do in that book. I live in Nebraska. I don't live in DC. How does she know Pete Hegseth, a possible future Secretary of Defense? I doubt she knows many of the other folks who are under consideration or were under consideration. He's unique in that way. People know who he is and they know what he stands for. Yeah, well, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm talking to John Waters. He's a contributor at Real Clear Defense and the author of the novel about veteran affairs called River City One. I highly commend it to you. It's a great read. The other thing that we know Trump has talked about is this warrior board, I guess they're calling it, to review senior officers in the U.S. military. The idea is to weed out so-called woke generals. What do you make of that, and how does this pick fit into that program, do you think? I don't know the full details on the so-called warrior board. From what you're suggesting, I think it makes sense in terms of what Pete Hegseth has been on the record saying, as far as we have certain generals who are fighting generals. And this is something that's talked about inside of the military and always has been kind of an understood point. There are political generals, those who make their career in garrison or at universities or in DC in the Beltway. They develop patrons, they're experts in the tank, so to speak. And then there are generals who excel in the field, and you can see it on their chests. There are those who have many combat-oriented ribbons and medals, others who have fewer of those, yet they hold the same ranks. The latest development in this is to call them woke generals, from political to woke generals. And so President Trump has said we need to slim down these ranks. And Pete Hegseth has said he's the man to do it. Again, in terms of ideology, I think they're aligned and it makes sense. Well, John, last question. He does have a complicated personal life, 3 wives, 7 children. Does that make any difference at all? Or is that just, is that going to come up, do you think? I'm sure it will come up. It is a complicated personal life. The president himself, a complicated personal life. The deeper question, though, is I don't know his family, and I suppose we'll get to know them better in the coming days. Yeah. Okay. Well, you've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I've been talking to John Waters. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back after this.